Welcome to the second lesson of Unit 3 about Congress. Today's topic is 3.2, How a Bill Becomes a Law. By the end of today's notes, you should be able to describe how federal laws are created. Remember to be following along on your fill in the blanks note sheet as we go. In this lesson, I'm going to give you a couple different ways to answer the question, how does a bill become a law? I'm going to start out with the short version, which is what you're going to have to be able to explain to me if you're looking to get a minimum or a basic on the civic literacy portion of the upcoming unit test. I'll then give you a longer version and give you more details after that to help you flush out a proficient or advanced explanation of how a bill becomes a law, but really it's up to you to show me how deeply you understand this process. And trust me, it can get pretty complicated. So let's start with the short and easy version. Before we can begin, we have to understand some basic vocabulary. So you remember legislative power is the power to create laws. This power was given to Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution. It's also shared by the state legislatures, who each have their own legislative powers to create laws using the reserved powers. The legislative process is just the name for the process of making a new law. I'll be using the word bill a lot in here, and bill here simply means a suggested law that is not yet passed by Congress and signed by the President, and thus cannot be enforced. Essentially, a bill is just a member of Congress's idea of what a law should be. So here's the simple version of how a bill becomes a law. The first step is the bill has to be introduced in either the House or the Senate by a member of Congress. Now, for most bills, it really doesn't matter whether it first gets introduced in the House or the Senate. It can be introduced in either one first. The only exception is bills that have to do with taxing and spending. Those have to start out in the House. Now, this entire process is the same whether it's the House or the Senate, so I'm just going to pick the House for simplicity's sake, but this whole thing would go the same way if they had started in the Senate. So let's start in the House. A member of the House of Representatives has an idea for a law, so they write up a bill and they introduce it to the House. Essentially, they're just filing the paperwork saying, hey, I think we should vote on this bill. That bill, depending on what it's about, gets sent to a different committee. Committees are just basically small working groups. You can think of them like group projects. Remember, there are 435 members of the House of Representatives, and it's really unrealistic to expect all 435 to be talking about, reading, researching, and doing all the work of a single bill. So instead, they break themselves up into working groups that specialize in different areas of expertise. So if your bill is about increasing the pay for soldiers, it would go to the Armed Services Committee. If it's instead about building a high-speed rail system across the country, it would go to the Transportation Committee. And if it was about promoting the use of electric cars, it would go to the Energy Committee, or Commerce Committee, really. It could go to any number. Sometimes it goes to multiple. It's in these committees that they're researched by the members of that committee. Now, this research involves actually doing research like we ask you to do in high school that most people don't actually do, but also involves going out and interviewing people who are specialists in that area, getting their testimony, seeing how it's going to affect Americans, how it's going to affect our economy, how it will affect the world. Once they've done all their research and they had all their interviews, the committee will vote on whether they want to accept the bill and pass it on and recommend it to the rest of the House, or they'll vote to kill it, and then it just stops. If the entire committee, or the majority of the committee, agrees to recommend it to the full House, it then goes to the entire 435 members of the House to vote on it. If over half of the members of the House agree that it should become a law, it's then sent over to the other half of Congress, in this case, the Senate. Now, if it had gone through this process starting in the Senate, at this point it would go to the House for a vote. But the important thing is, once it goes to the other chamber, either the House or the Senate, it starts back up again going through that committee process. Once again, the members of the Senate in this case, in their committee, their small work groups, they'll do their own research, they'll do their own interviews, and then eventually they'll have a vote to decide whether to recommend it to the full Senate or to vote to recommend that it die, and then it just dies. If the committee does recommend it to the entire Senate, then the Senate will take it up for debate, they'll discuss it, and they'll vote on it. And if the majority of the Senate, over 50 of the senators, agree that it should become a law, this is when it gets sent to the President of the United States. Of course, this will only happen if both the House and Senate version are identical. If any changes happened in the Senate to the bill before they voted on it, then it wouldn't get sent to the President. Instead, it would go to this thing called a conference committee, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, the president has a couple options when a bill gets to him from Congress. We're not going to talk about all those options in the simple answer. The simple, short version is when the president gets the bill, he then signs it and it becomes a law. Or he can veto it and say it does not become a law. That again is the short version of how a bill becomes a law. If you're able to repeat that back to me on a test asking you how a bill becomes a law, you'd probably range in, minimum basic range on that. But if you want to get a higher score on that question, let's talk about a slightly longer version of how a bill becomes a law. On your note sheet, you'll see this image, but you'll see the boxes don't have any words in it. You have to double click on that box in order to edit it to fill in these boxes. But let's do a little more complicated version of how a bill becomes a law, so let's get a little more detail here. Just like in the short version, a bill can start in either the Senate or the House. Remember, if a bill has to do with spending money or taxing, it must start in the House. Otherwise, the bill can start in either chamber. It really doesn't matter which. In the short version, we talked about the bill starting out in the House. So in this version, let's pretend it's starting out in the Senate. Starting in the Senate, a bill has to be introduced by a member of the Senate. You have to be a senator to introduce the bill. Once the bill is introduced, it's sent to one of many committees. Remember, committees are small work groups that specialize in different areas. So if the bill is about, say, education policy, it would go to the Education Committee. If it's about the Armed Services, it's going to go to the Armed Services Committee. So there we see what happens. They either votes it down and the bill is dead, or the majority of the committee, after doing their research and doing their interviews with experts, they'll vote yes and recommend that the whole Senate pass it. The bill will then go to the full Senate, where all 100 senators will get a chance to talk, argue, and discuss the bill in hand. If they cannot get 50 votes, then it is dead. It is over. If it's voted with 51 or more senators, it then goes over here following this path where it says it must pass both chambers of Congress. The Senate is one chamber, it's past that, but now it's got to go to the House of Representatives. Once it goes there, it must be go to a committee where it will be debated, discussed. They'll do their research, interview more people about it, and the committee will either vote no and the bill will die, or the majority of the committee members will vote yes and the bill will proceed to the whole House. Now in the whole House, this is where we'll have all the members of the House will get to debate it, discuss it, make changes to it. One key difference in the House that makes it different than the Senate is that in the House, you can only speak for about 5 minutes at most about the topic. In the Senate, there is no limit to how long you're allowed to talk. So back to the House. It's on the full floor. All 435 members of the House are discussing it, getting their say on it, and then they'll come to a vote. If they cannot get the majority, half or more, to agree, then it's dead. The bill is over. If over half of the House agrees that it should become a law, then it goes here. But the problem is, if the Senate and the House version don't say the exact same thing. If, for instance, the Senate said that they were going to give $1 billion to the military for purposes of buying new tanks, and the House says, no, we only want to give $500 million to buy new tanks. We don't need $1 billion in new tanks. We only want $500 million. Well, that's a difference, right? The Senate and the House just passed two bills that are different, and so it cannot become a law. So instead, it goes to what's called a conference committee, which will have members of the Senate and members of the House, and they'll meet together and they'll try to discuss how they can come up with a compromise that will pass the Senate and the House. So, for instance, in our theoretical case, where the Senate wants $1 billion on tanks and the House wants only $500 million on tanks, well, they might agree to split the difference and say $750,000 for tanks. Then the bill will go back to the Senate, where they will vote on it. It won't go through committee anymore, but it'll go back to the full floor of the Senate where they will debate on it. They will not be allowed to make changes, just debate on it, yes or no. And then it will also go back through the House, where again, it skips the committee step, goes straight to the full floor of the House, and they will vote straight up or down, yes or no on the compromise. If they cannot both agree on that compromise, the bill is dead. Now, let's assume that it passes the Senate, the House, the conference committee comes up with a compromise that again passes the Senate and the House, and then it goes to the president. Now, the president has several options, right? In the short version, we said the president can sign the bill into law, or the president can veto the bill, send it back to Congress, and then they have to do their voting all over again. And again, if the president vetoes it, it's not going to go through committee. It's just going to go back to the full floor of the Senate and back to the full floor of the House. Well, in order to override the president's veto and make it a law, they're going to need 2/3 of the Senate to say yes and 2/3 of the House to say yes. So 2/3 of the Senate and 2/3 of the House must agree or it will not become a law and the veto is successful. If 2/3 of the House and the Senate do agree, then the president's veto is overridden and it becomes the law of the land. Now that we looked at ways that a bill can become a law, if you want to get that proficient or advanced, you're also going to have to be able to explain to me ways in which a bill can die before becoming a law. So let's take a quick look at some of those options. You'll remember that the first stop for a bill after being introduced is going to a committee. But in that committee, if the majority of the members don't like it, the bill can be voted down and then will be killed and will not be brought to a vote on the floor of the House or the Senate. If it does pass committee, it could die by not receiving a majority vote in the House or the Senate. So those first two methods of a bill dying before becoming a law, I mentioned earlier in the video. Number 3 is something we haven't talked about yet. Bills need to go through this entire process before the next election. If a bill is introduced and goes through all those processes and all those steps we talked about, but doesn't actually get signed by the president until after the next Congress has been sworn in after an election, that bill is dead. The time is up. A fourth way a bill could die is if it passes in the House and the Senate, but either the House or the Senate has made changes to the bill and they can't agree in conference committee on the wording of the bill. They can't agree to a compromise wording that gets through both the House and the Senate, well, then it dies. A fifth way a bill can die is if the president vetoes a bill or refuses to sign it. A veto means the bill will go back to Congress, and they'll have a chance to override that veto with a 2/3 majority vote in both the House and then a 2/3 majority vote in the Senate. If he refuses to sign the bill, it will become a law after 10 days. That is, unless Congress is no longer in session. If Congress adjourns, meaning the members go home in that 10-day period, and the president refuses to sign it in that 10-day period, then the bill would die. I know it's complicated, but it's known as a pocket veto because essentially the president's putting the bill in his pocket, waiting it out, and then if Congress adjourns within that 10 days, then he can just have the bill killed and Congress would not have a chance to override his veto. Remember, we talked about this. Vetoes can be overridden with a 2/3 vote in the House and 2/3 vote in the Senate in order for it to become a law without the president's signature. So the sixth way a bill can die is that if it passes the House and the Senate, the president vetoes it, and they don't have the House and the Senate don't have the votes to override that veto, then it's dead. A seventh way a bill could die is the leaders of the House or the Senate refuse to hold a vote on the bill. Now, I know what you might be thinking here. What the heck is a leader in the House and the Senate? We'll get there, but essentially the leaders in each chamber have a lot of power in deciding when bills get voted on or if they get voted on at all. If they don't like a bill, they have the power to basically decide not to hold a vote in the chamber. All right, let's talk about who these leaders are in Congress and what they do in the first place. We just talked about how they have the ability to decide when bills get voted on, but let's learn a little bit more about them. Let's start on the Senate side. The leader of the Senate is known as the President of the Senate. That is the same person as the Vice President of the United States. So currently, that is Vice President J.D. Vance. So he's the Vice President in the executive branch, but he serves as the President of the Senate in the legislative branch. This sounds like they have a lot of power and are really important, but really they don't do a lot. So they've got two main jobs in the Senate. First, they preside over the Senate and cast tie-breaking votes. You remember there are 100 members in the Senate, so if there are 50 votes for something and 50 votes against something, that is the only time the vice president would actually be able to cast a vote in order to break the tie. Currently, Republicans hold 53 of the 100 Senate seats in the U.S. Senate, so if 3 Republicans decide not to vote for a bill, then J.D. Vance, as president of the Senate, would cast the tie-breaking vote. The other job that the president of the Senate has is managing the floor of the Senate. Basically, that means they get to decide whose turn it is to speak on a bill. So there really isn't a lot for the president of the Senate to do, so they're usually not there unless they know that it's going to be a close vote. So the day-to-day work of managing the floor of the Senate, getting to decide whose turn it is to speak on a bill, falls to the job of the president pro tempore, which is Latin for essentially president for the time being. They basically do the job of recognizing who gets to speak when the vice president is not president. Currently, this job is being held by 91-year-old Republican Senator from Iowa, Chuck Grassley. Well, the president of the Senate is from the same party as the president of the United States because they're the vice president of the United States. The president pro tempore is picked by the party that has the majority of the seats in the Senate. Now, currently, Republicans control the White House, so J.D. Vance is a Republican, but Republicans also control 53 of the 100 seats in the Senate. That's why Republicans got to choose the president pro tempore in the Senate. However, if Democrats controlled 53 of the seats, then they would have been able to pick the president pro tempore. Now again, this job doesn't have a lot of power. The real power in the Senate is held by the Senate Majority Leader. Their job is to schedule debates and business of the Senate. So if they don't like a bill, that bill will never get voted on because they can just decide to delay that vote until, well, it's just too late to hold any votes. This effectively gives them a power to kill any bill they don't like. They also get the bonus of being able to have the right to speak first in any debate on the floor of the Senate. Their primary job is getting bills passed that match their party's political ideology. You'll remember that Republicans follow the conservative ideology and Democrats follow the liberal ideology in general. Currently, the Senate Majority Leader is South Dakota Republican Senator John Thune. Now, there are other leadership jobs in the Senate, but these are just the ones that I want you to focus on and know about for our lessons. In the House side, they have a lot of leadership roles as well, but what you really need to understand is the most powerful person in the House and in the Senate is this man, Mike Johnson, a Republican from Louisiana. His title is Speaker of the House, and he's chosen by the majority party in the House. Currently, Republicans have more seats in the House than Democrats because of the last election in 2024, and so Mike Johnson was elected by Republicans to be their leader and to be in control of the House of Representatives. What's more important than that is they are the most powerful person in Congress, even more powerful than the majority leader of the Senate. The Speaker of the House only has power in the House of Representatives itself, but he has extra powers that the majority leader in the Senate doesn't, and so that technically makes him a little bit more powerful. He's also third in line to be president, so if something happened to the president and vice president, then Mike Johnson would become the president in their stead. The Speaker of the House presides over the business of the House of Representatives in the same way the President of the Senate does in the Senate. However, they also act like the majority leader in the Senate in that they decide on which bills get to be voted on when, and so if they don't like a bill, then they'll never get a vote, and that bill will die. Just like the President of the Senate, or the President pro tempore of the Senate, the Speaker of the House manages the House floor debate, so they get to decide who gets to speak and when for how long. They also focus on getting bills passed through the House that match their party's ideology. So Mike Johnson here, he's trying to get as many conservative bills passed through the House as possible. Next, let's talk about the differences in how the House and the Senate operate, because they each have their own rules about how they vote on things, and there's some quirks to how each chamber operates. First off, the House has certain special rules. So for instance, all tax and spending bills have to start in the House. Now, this is important. I will be asking you about this on the test. So if a bill has to do with taxing or spending, that bill must start in the House. All other bills can start in the Senate or the House. Doesn't really matter. This is the one special circumstance. The House is also the only one that has the power to impeach members of the other branches. That is to say, to accuse them of a serious crime. They don't get to decide if that person, the president, a judge, or another member of the executive branch is guilty. They just get to accuse. Guilt and innocence is decided in the Senate. Another special rule is that any suggested changes to a bill have to have something to do with the topic. So you can't just have a bill about education and then decide to put a line in there about adding funding to the military. Any changes have to have something to do with the bill. Seems weird that we have to say that, but when we get to the Senate, you'll realize it's a little different. Another quirk is that speakers in the House are limited to 5 minutes of speaking at any given time. That's because there are 435 voting members, and so if you give everyone more than 5 minutes of speaking, politicians tend to take as much time as they want to talk, so you really want to make sure they wrap things up quickly. On the Senate side, this is where if you're impeached in the House, the Senate gets to act as the trial, and if you are found guilty in the Senate, they have the power to remove you from power. But again, in order for the Senate to actually vote to remove you from power, the House must first make the accusation. Another quirk that's different in the Senate is that if you're going to suggest a change to a bill, an amendment, that amendment doesn't have to do anything with the topic of the bill. So, for instance, at that bill on education we were talking about in the House, well, you wanted to add a few $1 billion to the military spending, you can add that as an amendment in the Senate, just not in the House. This is a special thing called a rider. It's just a rule the Senate has made for themselves, where in the House, they said you can't do that. It's generally because the Senate has fewer members, and so it's easier for them to debate these kind of things. The Senate also has no time limit on how long any member can talk about any topic. This is known as a filibuster. Originally, it was designed to make it so that the senators can just talk about a bill until they've hammered out all the differences and all that needs to be said has been said. However, in modern times, the filibuster has been used as a tool in order to talk a bill to death. Essentially, because the Senate can only debate on one bill at a time, you gum up things, you make things take so long that everyone in the Senate just agrees to give up on that bill, even if there are enough votes to pass it, in order to get you to shut up. Now, filibusters have special rules. For instance, you're not allowed to stop talking except to answer the question that someone's asked you. You cannot sit down, you must be standing the whole time, and you cannot leave the room. You're also not allowed to lean on anything, so you have to be standing the whole time. Now, you don't have to be talking about the bill itself. You can talk about whatever you want for as long as you want. Now, filibusters will end only if one of the rules are broken or there's enough votes to get you to shut up. Well, you need 51 votes to pass a bill in the Senate. It actually requires 60 votes to agree to end debate on a bill. That's called cloture, an important vocabulary word. So, filibusters require 60 senators to agree to end the debate. That's why in the Senate, it actually takes 60 votes to pass anything, because if they don't have 60 votes, then someone's going to filibuster and just keep talking until that bill's dead. They did change the rules on the filibuster in the 1970s. So, starting in the 1970s, you no longer have to actually talk during the filibuster. Instead, you just have to threaten to filibuster. If one member threatens to filibuster, that bill is put on a pause, and another bill is brought up for debate until one of two things happens. The senator threatening the filibuster agrees to drop it, or 60 senators agree to vote for cloture, and then they can continue on the bill. But essentially, since the 1970s, all you have to do to use a filibuster to kill a bill is say that you, the single senator, are going to threaten to filibuster, and that's it. Unless 60 other senators agree to get you to stop talking, that bill is as good as dead. You'll notice that the use of filibusters on this chart really didn't happen very much for a large chunk of this country, right? This chart starts in 1917. Not a lot of filibusters here. You'll see starting in the 1960s, a rise in the 60s of filibusters. Good chunk here. This is the civil rights movement, and so a lot of civil rights bills are being filibustered during this period. Now, in the 1970s, when you no longer have to actually talk during the filibuster, you just have to threaten it, you can see all of a sudden, boom, a giant spike in the number of filibusters over the years. The red lines are with filibusters by Republicans, the blue ones are filibusters by Democrats. You'll notice a massive spike in filibusters starting in the year 2007-2008. This is when President Obama took office, and the filibuster was used to block a lot of the president's agenda. Now, this chart doesn't go into President Trump's terms, but when you see the Democrats in control of the Senate when President Trump is in charge, you'll notice the same thing happening with Democrats using the filibuster quite a bit during that period as well. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people think that our current system is broken. Alright, as always, take a couple minutes here to rewrite today's goal at the bottom of your note sheet. Identify 3 important facts from today's notes that help demonstrate you understand today's goal. And as always, write one question you still have about this process that can help you better understand today's goal. We'll see you in class.